大学とネバダ大学にお勤めのダレル・ラトキン博士のですね、講演、Astrology in the Middle Ages, Renaissance and Early Modern Europe, Reappraisal というタイトルなんですけれども、こちらをですね、博士に講演していただきます。で、博士ですね、前近代の占星術に関しては、世界のですね、トップを走る方です。で、今日はですね、私が司会ではなくてですね、博士のことをですね、よく知るですね、ルネサンス思想史の第一人者であるですね、平井博士にですね、司会進行をお務めいただきたいと思います。ここからはですね、平井博士にですね、マイクを代わりましてですね、講演会を進めていきたいと思います。お願いいたします。マイクが遠いかもよ。
ちょっと今回は狭い部屋を取ったんですよね。どんな感じになるかなと思って。そしたらば、おとといなんですけど、やはり大阪大学で、同じ講演会をしたんですけど、そこはこのダブルの大きさの部屋、長さの部屋で、そこが満杯になっちゃったんですね。60名を超える人々がいらして、すごいことだなということで、でも時間的に急遽部屋を変えることができなかったので、ちょっとすし詰め状態なんですけども、お許しください。私、ちょっと間抜けなことに、足を骨折しまして、こういう状態になってしまっているんですけれども、その点についてもご容赦願いたいと思います。まずこの、ダレルを日本に呼ぶことができたのは、僕とねじめ先生が代表なんですね。どうぞお待ちください。科研費を取りまして、科研の基盤 B で、1200万円の3年間のもので、西洋ルネッサンスと日本におけるキリシタンの世紀というプロジェクトなんですけれども、これから3年間にわたって、日本での国際会議、それから、主に米国のルネサンス学会で、いろいろなパネルの企画を提案して、そこで発表していくという形を取ろうというふうな計画で、次回の3月、来年の3月にニューヨークで行われるルネサンス学会には、僕とダレル、それから今本の紹介、ちょっとここに座っていいですか、すみません本の紹介をしてもらいました榎本恵美子さん、ねじめさん先生の親友で、古くからの親友で、僕の大先輩なんですけれども、彼女の本の制作をお手伝いして、やっとのことで、この1週間、今週ちょうど出た、出来たてのほやほやの本で、この一番前に座っている坂本君も解説で、参加してくれている、我々の二人三脚ならず、3人4脚、5脚という努力の結晶の、僕が立ち上げた BH 総書っていう軽装書房から出る総書の第1冊目ということです。そこにね、総書の説明ですとか、本の説明、この本についての説明がありますので、それを持ち帰ってください。今ですと2割引きで買えますので、大変お得になっております。その、申し込み書がないといけないんですけどね。そういったことで、それからその、ルネサンス学会に、昨日、嬉しいお知らせが来まして、我々がニューヨークに提案しておりました、パネル企画のうちの一つ、ダレルと僕とこの榎本恵美子さんの3人で、ナンシー・白石先生とトニー・グラフトン先生の前で、 占星術、医学占星術夢、解釈についてのパネルセッションっていうのを行うんですけども、それが採択されました。それからもう一つ同時に、プロジェクトの、ねじめ先生と平岡隆二君という九州の、熊本にいる、研究者の宇宙論についての発表、それから誰ともう一人今回ゲストで呼んだホルヘ・レド氏の、3人の発表からなる日本におけるキリシタンの世紀っていうパネル企画も採択されましたんで、我々全部で合わせて3本と2本で5本の発表、それからトニー・グラフトン先生のコメントがつくわけで、まあ、6本のペーパーからなる2つのセッションを我々のその科研費プロジェクトで、世界に向けて発信するという形になっています。そうしたわけで、ダレルとはもう長い付き合いなんですけれども、前回、そのサンディエゴで行われた、ルネサンス学会で僕が企画した1日がかりの4つのセッションからなる12本の発表があるパネル企画の中にダレルも参加してくれまして、ちょうどその日でしたがね、その日の夜に、科研費が受かったっていう嬉しい知らせが来たんですね。4月の2日だったと思います。それで、これは素晴らしいということで、ぜひともダレルにも日本に来てほしいと。その時から始まった、この招聘のアイデアでした。そしてそれが今回実現して、この1週間、ダレルと僕で、東京、それから占星術家の鏡隆二さんを交えたトークショー、それから阪大での講演会といろいろ占星術の歴史に関するイベントをこなしてきました。で、今日がね、その全てのイベントのクライマックスということで、ぜひとも皆さん、ダレルの研究の真髄の部分を見ていただければいいんじゃないかなと思います。現在の、世界における西洋占星術の歴史研究において、一番、トップランナーと言って僕はいいと思います。それで、ピコ・ミナンドラの占星術反駁の全英訳を準備しつつ、それから、西洋占星術についての大著をもうすぐ出版することになっています。それでは、ダレル、Are you ready?
Never, yes.
では、大きな拍手でお迎えください。I don't know. Try your voice first, maybe, but you need a free hand, right?
What? If I can do this, then I can do this,
Okay.
or I can
Yeah.
stand up
Okay.
just with
Yeah.
the paper.
As you feel.
No, which do you? Should I stand? I mean, people can't see. My
You can
voice
first
is.
stand, say something, then maybe sit. Or as マイクあった方がいいですよね、やっぱりね。Yes, with mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I
So
have
maybe
to sit.
sit down.
Thank you very much for coming. Astrology was finally removed from the domain of legitimate natural knowledge during the 17th and 18th centuries, but the precise contours of this removal remain obscure. It is clearly documented, but not widely known, however, that astrology was taught from the beginning of the 14th century as an important part of the arts and sciences curriculum at the finest medieval and Renaissance universities, including Padua, Bologna, and Paris, where it was taught within 3 distinct scientific disciplines: mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine. As I have found, astrology served to integrate the highly developed mathematical sciences of antiquity, astronomy and geography, and geometrical optics, with Aristotelian natural philosophy, This deeply mathematicized astrologizing Aristotelianism provided fundamental patterns of interpretation and analysis in pre-modern, that is, pre-Newtonian science. I contend that the history of astrology, in particular, the story of its protracted criticism and ultimate removal from the realm of legitimate knowledge, is central for understanding the transition from pre-modern Aristotelian Ptolemaic natural philosophy to modern Newtonian science. This removal was neither obvious nor unproblematic. Astrology was not some sort of magical, nebulous hodgepodge of beliefs. Rather, astrology emerged in the 13th century as a fully mathematical system that served to integrate astronomy and natural philosophy, precisely the aim of the new science of the 17th century. As such, it becomes a fundamentally important historical question to determine why this promising astrological synthesis should have been rejected in favor of a rather different mathematical natural philosophy, and one with a very different causal structure than Aristotle's. It has been claimed in this regard that Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's extensive attack on astrology, the disputations against divinatory astrology, convinced the astrologers to stop practicing on its publication in 1496. Further, Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres of 1543 and its promotion of a heliocentric cosmos is said to have completed astrology's undoing. Both claims are belied, however, by the fact that the two most important warriors for the Copernican cause, Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler, were both practicing astrologers in the early 17th century. Influenced by Pico's disputations, Kepler set out to reform astrology on a sounder natural philosophical and mathematical foundation. Further, Francis Bacon proposed his own reform of astrology in one of his last scientific works, the De Augmentis Scientiarum of 1623. This evidence strongly suggests that the role of astrology in the scientific revolution is more complex and significant than previously thought. In fact, there seem to be at least three simultaneous, often competing discourses that span the spectrum from perpetuating the status quo to reform to outright rejection. My research to date has primarily focused on Italy, Germany, and England as I work towards a comprehensive account. In this talk, I will first set the historical stage by describing astrology's three major disciplinary locations in the pre-modern map of knowledge circa 1250 to 1600, namely mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine. I will articulate their fundamental conceptual and disciplinary patterns and situate them in their primary institutional locus, their instruction at the universities. On this basis, I will construct an interpretive framework to use later for analyzing astrology's subsequent removal or disappearance, partial appropriation, or whatever the proper characterization turns out to be. Secondly, I will indicate astrology's place in the work of major scientific revolution figures, primarily Galileo and Francis Bacon. Finally, I use the interpretive framework to approach perhaps the most important unanswered question in the historiography of early modern science, namely, a sound account of how, when, and ultimately why astrology came to be removed from its previously central place in pre-modern Aristotelian Ptolemaic natural knowledge during the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. To provide the proper conceptual structures for understanding astrology's configuration within pre-modern natural knowledge, I will briefly describe a profoundly mathematicized astrologizing Aristotelianism as found in influential 13th century natural philosophers, including Albertus Magnus, his most famous student Thomas Aquinas, and Roger Bacon. First, however, astrology should be characterized according to Ptolemy's classic definition in his deeply influential astrological treatise, the Tetrabiblos, composed in the 2nd century AD. There are two primary kinds of what he calls foreknowledge through the science of the stars, which he then clearly distinguishes. The first, what we call astronomy, mathematically studies the motions of the heavenly bodies. It is an exact science. The second, astrology, investigates their influences on the earth. Because of the interaction with matter, it is not an exact science. In Aristotle's natural philosophy, the movements of the heavens, especially the sun, are utterly fundamental to life on Earth. I will briefly discuss two central passages that later became basic texts in Aristotle commentaries for discussing astrologically related issues. In On Generation and Corruption, Aristotle argued that the sun, in its motion around the ecliptic, as the universal efficient or moving cause, is ontologically prior to and necessary for generation and corruption, that is, something coming into being and passing away. Therefore, in processes of generation, human and otherwise, the sun as efficient cause is required along with the male, who provides the formal cause in the seed, and the female, who provides the material cause in the womb. In his commentary on this passage, written around 1250, Albertus Magnus expanded the realm of the efficient cause to also include the rest of the planets. In his treatise on the heavens, De Caelo, Aristotle discussed celestial influences, which he limited to motion and light with its concomitant heat. The sun's motion as universal efficient cause, as we saw, is central to generation. In the medieval period, this influence is once again extended from the sun to include all the planets, whose motion and light also provide the basis for their mathematization, as we will see. Further, in his commentary on De Caelo, Albertus stated explicitly that these texts provide the scientific foundations for astrological practice. These natural philosophical structures were fitted onto a fundamentally Ptolemaic cosmographic framework composed of mathematical astronomy calibrated with mathematical geography. This framework allows the planetary motions to be uniquely located for any time, at any place, by means of the horizon. This is important precisely because place is central for analyzing generation. I quote Albertus: "If anyone wished to understand all the natures and properties of particular places, he would know that there is not a point in them which does not have a special property from the virtue of the stars. For the circle of the horizon is varied in relation to each point of the habitation of animals, plants, and stones, and the entire orientation of the heavens is varied in relation to the varying circle of the horizon, from which cause their natures, properties, customs, actions, and species, which seem to be generated in the same perceptible place, are varied to such an extent that diverse properties and customs are attributed to twins' seeds, both for brute animals and for men from this different orientation. And this is reasonable, because it has been learned that the heavens pour forth formative virtues into everything which exists. Moreover, it mostly pours them forth by means of rays emitted by the lights of the stars, and therefore it follows that each pattern and angle of rays causes different virtues in things below." Unquote. Once the planets are mapped in this way and related to each place on Earth, we can then analyze their influences using the other primary feature of this system, a geometrical optical model of planetary influences allowed by their other mode of influence, light, understood as lines of radiation. The angular relationship of the planets to each other, the planetary aspects, and their collective relationship to each place on Earth may then be fully articulated. When the different qualitative natures of each planet in them textbook, the Liber Introductorius, and Pseudo-Ptolemy's Centiloquium, a fundamental astrological text for medical practitioners. In the fourth year, the student moved on to more advanced works in both astrology and astronomy, Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos and Almagest, and the On Urans Unseen, an astrological treatment of medical questions. Astrology was also taught in a different respect in the natural philosophy course at Bologna. The 3-year course in philosophy treated, among others, the core texts of Aristotelian natural philosophy, including those that provided astrology's natural philosophical foundations, namely On the Heavens, On Generation and Corruption, and the Meteorology during the first 2 years of the course. Finally, The 4-year medical course focused on medical texts, including those with a strongly astrological character, specifically Galen's On Critical Days, which was studied during each of the first 3 years of the course. As for Pietro D'Abano at Padua, medical training was one of the primary ends towards which the Arts and Medicine faculty at Bologna was oriented. There is extensive evidence that this integrated pattern of medically oriented scientific education continued throughout the 16th and well into the 17th century. For example, Regiomontanus articulated these disciplinary patterns in the 1464 inaugural oration for his course on Alfaragani's astronomy at the University of Padua. Likewise, from 1530 on, Philip Melanchthon used this same conceptual and disciplinary configuration to reform the now Lutheran German universities, which educated, among many others, Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. These patterns also continued throughout the 16th century at the University of Bologna, as exemplified in the life and work of Giovanni Antonio Magini, who taught astrology and medicine there from 1588 to 1617. Using these disciplinary and curricular patterns, one may more accurately characterize both the pre-modern map of natural knowledge and its educational institutionalization, by means of which this knowledge was passed down as normal science from generation to generation. Using these conceptual and institutional structures to construct an interpretive framework, then, one may also more accurately trace significant stages in the transformation from pre-modern to modern disciplinary configurations. The framework developed here is intended to orient future research. With this background, let us now turn to astrology and the scientific revolution. It is well known that Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, major figures in the astronomical revolution, were both practicing astrologers during their entire careers. Unlike Tycho and Kepler, however, the extensive evidence for Galileo's practice of astrology has been significantly underrepresented, if not systematically ignored. As I have demonstrated in a recent article, Galileo was a practicing astrologer during most, if not all, of his career. Most of our evidence comes from his period as professor of mathematics at the University of Padua, where we have indubitable evidence that he constructed and interpreted horoscopes for patrons, students, and his own family. For Giovan Francesco Segredo, for example, we have an extensive horoscope with many tables and the brief notes for an interpretation in Galileo's astrological manuscript 81 in Florence. The manuscript, which I have examined in person, has 27 horoscopes in Galileo's own hand, including Segredo's, Galileo's own horoscope, and his 2 daughters, Virginia and Livia. Here is Livia's, which also has an interpretation. Beyond manuscript 81, Galileo also dedicated his epoch-making telescopic discoveries to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo II de' Medici, in the Siderius Nuncius of 1610. In it, he associated the newly discovered moons of Jupiter, the Medicean stars, with Jupiter's powerful placement in the midheaven of Cosimo's horoscope. Indeed, this horoscope exists on the same folio as one of Galileo's wash drawings of the moon. Here is also the completed horoscope, which is also in Galileo's hand. Considering that Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres is often considered the death knell for astrology, it is striking and deeply problematic for this view that the two most prominent Copernicans of the early 17th century, Galileo and Kepler, were both practicing astrologers. I should also note that Tycho and Kepler were both concerned with reforming astrology, whereas Galileo seems to have been a normal, albeit sophisticated, practitioner. Francis Bacon proposed a serious reform of astrology in the De Augmentis Scientiarum of 1623, a Latin enlargement and reworking of his 1605 Advancement of Learning, written during the enforced retirement that followed his impeachment as Lord High Chancellor. In Book 3, Chapter 4, Bacon discussed astrology as a part of natural philosophy. Hoping to reform astrology as a sound astrology based explicitly on natural philosophical arguments, Bacon began by identifying the many superstitions and lies that needed to be removed, including the individual planetary rulership of each hour of the day, and the astrological figure constructed for precise points of time. Reviewing the four principal divisions of astrological practice, revolutions, nativities, elections, and interrogations, he argued that the last three had little, if any, foundation, while he described revolutions as much more sound, although still in need of attention. To make the doctrine of revolutions optimal in practice, Bacon described 5 general rules, most notably that the operation of the heavens is not strong on all kinds of bodies, but only on finer ones, such as humors, air, and spiritus. Retaining the traditional doctrines of planetary natures and aspects, Bacon then turned to predictions. His considered views after a lifetime as courtier and politician are striking. Astrological predictions can profitably be applied to both natural and political domains, including the weather, epidemics, and war, but only within a prescribed degree of specificity. He made 2 important points in this regard, noting that the domain in which astrological predictions may be applied is virtually infinite, but that a knowledge of the celestial configuration, the active, read efficient causes, does not suffice. One must also have a deep knowledge of the subjects at issue, the recipients of the active planetary influences. This knowledge seems to be precisely what his broader natural historical research program was intended to provide. Let us now turn to Bacon's views of elections, the astrological practice concerned with choosing the best times to begin any sort of venture. I quote from the 1640 English translation. Nor are elections altogether to be rejected, but more sparingly to be credited than predictions. For we see in planting and in sowing and in grafting that the observation of the phase of the moon is a matter not altogether vain and frivolous. But these elections are by our rules more restrained than predictions. And this must ever be observed, that elections are of force in such cases only where both the influx of the heavens is such as doth not suddenly pass over. and likewise the action of inferior bodies, such as is not presently perfected. For neither the increases of the moon nor of the planets are accomplished in an instant, but punctuality of time is by all means to be rejected. There are found many of the like precise observations which one would hardly believe in elections about civil affairs." Unquote. Bacon thus plainly states that there are significant realms in which astrological elections may legitimately be applied within the framework of a sound astrology. He also strongly implies his own personal experience with elections concerning political affairs. And in fact, this is precisely the part of astrology that Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States' astrologer, used very effectively in giving President Reagan astrological advice. In the final section, Bacon responded to a hypothetical challenge by indicating how a research program should be instituted to develop and clarify his earlier claims. Rejecting the collection of future experiences as futile, he suggested historical research to investigate precisely those features already mentioned as legitimate subjects of astrological prediction and election. In particular, astrologers should comb the best histories to locate important events, which should then be compared with the heavenly configurations at those times in accordance with his reforming precepts. Where there is a clear correlation, he concluded, a rule of prediction may be inferred, thus applying his inductive procedure to astrological reform. I have seen no discussion of Bacon's own use of astrology, but given the tenor of his statements, his ever precarious situation at court, and his passionate political ambitions, it seems very likely that he would have pursued this avenue of possible insight and thus advantage in the many areas in which he himself actively participated. At the very least, it is clear that Francis Bacon, whose writings were to be so influential on the researches of the Royal Society of London, provided strong encouragement for a program of scientific research in a reformed astrology, with a broad range of practical utility towards the end of his long career. Using the interpretive framework introduced earlier, I would now like to tease out some of the complex trajectories in the gradual removal, displacement, disappearance of astrology from one of its three disciplinary locations in the pre-modern map of knowledge, namely mathematics. A comprehensive account should also include natural philosophy and medicine. This is a preliminary indication of research very much in progress. A significant moment in the story of astrology's separation from astronomy was the explicit removal of astrology from the teaching of mathematics by Christoph Clavius, the primary developer of and textbook writer for the mathematics curriculum of the vast Jesuit educational empire. Clavius discussed astrology's removal in his vastly influential textbook version of Sacrobosco's On the Sphere, first published in 1570, with many later editions. Two caveats. First, Clavius only rejected astrology from its traditional teaching within the mathematics course. This does not imply, as I had initially thought, that he thereby wholly rejected astrology. Secondly, Clavius's rejection by no means indicates astrology's demise in mathematics education, even in Italy. As noted before, Maggini taught astrology and wrote influential textbooks for the mathematics course at the University of Bologna until his death in 1617. Further, Andrea Argoli taught astrology at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, from 1622 to 1627, then at the University of Padua from 1632 to 1656, where he also wrote mathematical and medical textbooks and compiled ephemerides. In England, the 1619 Civilian Statutes of Oxford University expressly forbade the newly established professor of astronomy from teaching the construction of nativities or judicial astrology. Nevertheless, there is significant evidence that astrology was studied and taught at the English universities up to and beyond this time. Astrology was also found in non-university mathematics textbooks, including those of Joseph Moxon, hydrographer to King Charles II, who published his A Tutor to Astronomy and Geography in 1674. It teaches one to construct horoscopes easily. This same Moxon, who lived from 1627 to 1691, became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1678. I would also like to mention John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal and Regius Professor of Astronomy at the newly erected Royal Greenwich Observatory, whose complex and ambivalent relation to astrology has been studied by Michael Hunter. It is striking to note that soon after completing an intensive critique of astrology in 1673, Flamsteed constructed a horoscope for the foundation of the Greenwich Observatory in 1675. This, however, was not part of his official duties. After the fact, he even wrote a subscription to make light of it. Risum teneatis, amici. Have a laugh, friends. Furthermore, he and Edmund Halley both provided the most accurate astronomical data available for the tables printed in George Parker's popular astrological almanacs in the 1690s. One facet of my research has focused on ephemerides, multi-year collections of planetary tables, which provide valuable further evidence for reconstructing astrology's changing place among the mathematical disciplines. Although I will focus on ephemerides from Bologna, the others I have examined from France, Germany, England, and elsewhere in Italy corroborate the picture presented here. Since 16th and 17th century ephemerides were overwhelmingly astrological, I thought to investigate when this astrological component disappeared. What I call astrological ephemerides normally have several explicitly astrological components. The first is a more or less extensive astrological introduction, which provides the basic information and instruction necessary to construct horoscopes, including planetary tables, as here, and tables of houses. Secondly, astrological ephemerides often also provide horoscopes for either the 4 cardinal points of the year, or at least for the sun's entry into Aries, as here, precisely the horoscopes used for making annual or quarterly prognostications. Likewise, in some astrological ephemerides, horoscopes would also be constructed for solar and lunar eclipses. Finally, there are almost always complete tables of planetary aspects. The significant angular Finally, there are almost always complete tables of planetary aspects, the significant angular relationships between the planets. These features are all found in Magini's ephemeris. The 17th century's ephemerides I have examined are all astrological. For the 18th century, I examined Eustachio Manfredi's ephemerides for 715 to 1725 for the use of the Bolognese Institute of Sciences. In its introduction, Manfredi explicitly tells the recipient of his dedicatory letter, Pope Clement XI, that he is deliberately removing the stain, astrology, from his ephemeris, unlike his predecessors, Regiomontanus, Magini, and Kepler. Only tables of planetary aspects remain. This does not mean, however, that astrology was finished in Bologna, as we can see in Marchio Antonio Ghisleri's ephemerides for 1721 to 1756, which provide horoscopes for eclipses and for the 4 cardinal parts of the year, 4 cardinal points of the year, as well as full tables of aspects. Of most interest is Ghisleri's extensive introductory letter to the reader, where he provides his own outlines for a reform of astrology, discussing, among others, Descartes and Newton. Finally, I have examined 2 ephemerides by Eustachio Zanotto, astronomer and fellow of the Bolognese Institute of Sciences, for the use of the Institute. The first is for 1751 to 1762. The second for 1775 to 1786. Neither mention astrology at all in the introductions, nor are there any horoscopes among the tables. The only remaining astrological vestiges are the planetary aspects. All the aspects appear in the earlier edition, whereas there is only a small apparatus at the bottom of the tables in the later edition. Likewise, the British Nautical Almanac and Astronomical Ephemerides, published from 1767 on, have nothing astrological in them whatsoever. Further research should refine and clarify the chronological outline indicated here. To conclude, in addition to the severing of astrology from astronomy among the mathematical disciplines, and thus the removal from its teaching there, I have also found a gradually widening fissure between so-called natural and judicial astrology, with the attempt to appropriate natural astrology into the new sorts of natural philosophy, and a concomitant rejection of judicial astrology's great number of rules and aims. Further, in England, after the extensive translations into English from 1640 on, in-depth astrological knowledge became accessible to a much broader part of the social spectrum. What remained of judicial astrology in the mid-18th century seems to continue primarily within popular culture, as found in almanacs that still retain their astrological character. There then seems to be a further transition in the 19th century, when astrology comes to be more strongly associated with the so-called occult sciences, including magic, alchemy, witchcraft, and the Kabbalah, where we still find her today, often also described as irrational or pseudoscientific. We are left then with many big questions, including why investigators into nature eventually lost hope or interest in a reformed astrology. This is easier to acknowledge than explain. For one, astrology came no longer to be taught at university, so it was no longer passed on as normal science from generation to generation. Secondly, different sorts of scientific questions came to be asked, and with a different set of causal assumptions. Finally, Astrological experiments often fail because astrology is not and has never been an exact science. I hope that my interpretive framework can be useful for more accurately describing the complex trajectories of removal, disappearance, and survival, which can then provide a proper basis for more precise, undoubtedly complex explanations, embodying conceptual, institutional, socio-political, and religious factors. Although finally removed from its conceptual and institutional matrix in Aristotelian, Ptolemaic, Galenic natural knowledge, astrology still continued to exist as a system of thought and practice, much as it had existed from antiquity through the 17th century, and much as it does today, where it continues to thrive even though it wholly lacks a conceptual foundation within today's legitimate sciences and the institutional support it formerly enjoyed. Indeed, the removal of astrology from the domain of legitimate natural knowledge seems to have been intimately connected with the undermining and removal of Aristotelian natural philosophy itself and its replacement by modern Newtonian science. Further research is required to make the story more precise, hopefully providing greater insight into the complex of factors associated with the rise of modern science and of astrology's role in that process. Thank you. I think so.
マイクは1個なんで、これからディスカッションを始めるために、ちょっとどういうふうにやるかなっていうふうに考えてますけれども、どうもありがとうございます。Thank you very much, Darrel. And now we're gonna open discussion. 日本語でもいいですので、皆さん、聞きたいことがあったら、本当にめったにない機会ですからね。どうぞよろしくお願いします。手を挙げてくだされば。はい。いいですよ。
Do you want to give her the mic since she's so close?
そうそう。届きます。小沢君、マイクないんですか ?1 個しか。
貴重なお話ありがとうございます。さっきガリレオ・ガリレイのホロスコープを紹介されて、四角形なのがすごく印象的だったんですけど、はい、最近私たちが使っているホロスコープって円形だと思うんですが、いつから四角から円になったのかなっていう。
So now astrology seems to use round horoscopes, and Galileo's one was square. So she was wondering when this change happened in the past.
That's a very good question, and in fact, I don't know the proper answer to that. What I do know is that the square version was normal during the entire period that I studied, through the 17th century and into the 18th century, as we saw the examples in Marchio Antonio Ghisleri. During that time, though, Tycho Brahe proposed a reform of the horoscope structure that was round and that had only 8 houses, mundane houses. Likewise, and I wish I had the images here, there was an astrologer during the English Revolution named William Lilly, who is very, very famous. And at the end of his, or in his Christian astrology, the printer went wild, and there must have been 40 different shapes for horoscopes. Okay, that for the earlier part. Then from the 19th century on, every horoscope I've seen is round. So it must have been somewhere in there, in between, that the round horoscopes became normal. Because in fact, as you pointed out, it is very normal that they're round, and it's much more intuitive to look at a round one, because that is the shape of the celestial sphere. But in fact, I don't know exactly when it changed.
そうです。他の質問はどうでしょうね。
Oh, you don't want to translate?
あ
Because most people.
You want?
More or less, you can get the short
簡
version.
単に翻訳しますと、長い歴史のうちでは、まあ、このイミさんの本にもちゃんと書いてあるんですけれども、まあ、誰が説明しなかった前の段階の初めに丸なんですね。それから四角になって、四角の時代が長いんです。四角が中世から18世紀、彼が言う18世紀まではずっと四角なんですね。まあ、その間にはいろいろなエキセントリックな人がいろいろなものを導入しようとしたりするんですけれども、長い流れは四角。で、19世紀、20世紀はまた丸になる。ただ、彼も誰がどのように丸にしたのかっていう、いつどういうふうにそれが起こったのかっていうのは、今のところわからないです。いいでしょうかね。じゃあ、どっちでもいいです。ここに来て、してください。マイクが届かない。
Hello. Kusama medieval. I have two questions. One is for the Middle Ages, Kusama medievalists, and for the second question is not much so later ones. The first one is, do you have any knowledge about how the curriculum of astrology spread from say Padua to what extent? In the geographic terms and in what way?
All throughout Europe, absolutely. In my experience, everywhere. Sometimes a 4-year course, as in Bologna, sometimes a smaller, sometimes 3 years. So there were some regional variations, but the same basic text. And yes, it was normal, absolutely normal.
Thank you. And the second question would be about this removal of astrology. And you mentioned this ephemery. How do you say that?
Ephemeris for
Ephemera.
Singular,
yes.
Ephemerides for plural.
Yes, and obviously, people must have discussed, the limits of astrological knowledge.
From Ptolemy on.
And so, you, I of course, I assume that you didn't just mention that discussions, which must have been going on when they were making those these tables. So if you could show us about, the contemporary discussions in 17th century or 18th century, that would be great. Even very short ones.
Yeah.
日本語で多いです。
まず1個目の質問から。1個目の質問は、その中世の大学ではどういうところで、先生術が教えられていたのか、それはだからボローネとかに限られているのかっていう質問に対して、ダレルの答えは、そこら、もう至るところ、中世の大学ではどこでも、基本的には先生術が正規の科目として教えられていました。その内容に関してはね、何をテキストブックに選ぶとか、そういうのは大学ごとに違ったりするんですけれども、大学教育においては知識人は全て先生術を学んだわけですね。実際に実践するかしないかは別問題として、大学の教科として教えない。それから2個目の質問は、エフェメリデスが、
言った方がいいですか？エフェメリデスの議論に、要するに天文学的知識がだんだん正規の知識体系から排除されていく形で、今日の講演の中では、エフェメリデスの中でだんだん排除されていくというか、っていうところに触れられたと思うんですけども、そういうテーブル表をたくさん作っていく中で、実際にやっぱり 先生術で使えないんじゃねとか、まあ、そういう議論をしてたに違いないと思うんですけども、そういう側面については今回の今日の講義の中では触れられなかったので、その点についてもうちょっと
なんか例を、some examples about the debate over astrological aspect of ephemeris.
で、その議論はずっとまあ、ずっとやられてたんだけれどもっていうところまでがお答えだったと思うんですけど。
Yeah, so debate, but
so
in general,
yeah, so you said, what people discussed how effective, this knowledge is all the time, but specifically in this time in the 18th century, what people are reading, because the thing is, obviously, the correlations between what's going on in the celestial spheres and earthly events. So you have to find the correlations. And how do you do that? And that must have been a focused discussion, I presume. But that'll be.
And this is very much the part of the story that I know least about. I have, a little bit of discussions, including Ghisleri's proposal for astrological reform in the introduction to his ephemerides in the mid-17th century, or mid-18th century, where he actually draws on Descartes and Newton's natural philosophy to try and explain how astrology works. Likewise, there's a professor of astronomy and meteorology at the University of Padua from 1763 to 1799 by the name of Giuseppe Toaldo, who proposes reform of astrology based primarily on the sun and the moon to try and explain how, to predict crops, the fluctuation in crops based on planetary motions. The scientific framework that they use for explaining how astrology works is basically the same one from the medieval period, where it's kind of geometrical optical model of celestial influences, where the influences are understood as light moving, with the planets. But of course, with the new scientific explanatory models, there becomes much more discussion, both more people being critical about it, but also people who are, for whatever reasons, thinking that there's still some validity, like Francis Bacon or Johannes Kepler wanting to reform astrology by removing a lot of its obscure rules, but also by sharpening its mathematical foundation, i.e. Kepler, changing the motion of the planets from circles to eclipses. And
Yes.
There's a great deal there, and I personally also look forward to exploring it more.
Thank you very much.
I hope that was at least some of what you.
エフェメルデスについては、彼もあまりまだ自分自身で研究が進めない部分で、ここでの話のためにいくつか例をかいつまんで話したけれども、まだ研究の余地は大きくて、そこでどういうふうに外国の質問があったような科学的なデータが集まってくると、それに対してどういうふうに、なんていうかな、先生術の方が対応したり、声を外したりとかっていうことが始まっていったのかっていうことについては、まだ研究の余地が未開の地に近いというかね、彼もまだいくつかの例を把握しているに過ぎないという。
じゃなくてもう少しというかもうちょっと言われたことはもう一つもう加えたので、それについて少し説明すると、要するに天上で世界で起こっていることと、それから地上の世界で起こっていることの関係をどういうふうに説明するのかっていう問題があって、でそれをそこの関係をどういうふうにつながるかっていうところにおいて、その16世紀、17世紀においてより問題が膨らんでいくわけですよね。で、そこで、要するに今日の講演の言われたように要するに それまでのその占星術の中で、こうオブスキュアなというか、あんまり定かではない要素を取り除いて、そしてケプラーとかベーコンのようにもっと数学的なところに注目して、そこをリファイン、定年することによって、その説明力を高めようとする流れもあれば、あるいはもうだんだんその地上で起こっている出来事に関して、またそれをどういう説明するかという他の議論がまた起こってきていて、それをこう占星術の体験の中で、もうそれはこう対処しきれないっていうふうに思う人たちも多分出てきている。でそこの部分に関してはまだまだダリルさんも、これからまだいろいろやらなきゃいけないことがあるというふうにおっしゃっています。
Darrel, I have one question.
Thank you very much.
How about the reaction of people who are involved in the project of encyclopedia in 18th century France? Because for the reception or transformation of image of alchemy, they were very, very important. And I was wondering their reaction or their attitude toward astrology. 僕の質問はそのフランスの18世紀の啓蒙思想家たち、百科全書を作った連中なんかはどういうふうに占星術を捉えていったのかっていうのが僕の質問。
That's a great question. In a longer version of this talk, I discussed the natural philosophical part of the story. And in that, I discussed the Encyclopédie by Diderot and D'Alembert, and its translation into English in the Cyclopedia. I'm forgetting the man's name. Do you know who I mean? It was very popular as well. And what I found there is that they are trying to separate out the panoply of rules and aims of judicial astrology from the natural philosophical part of astrological influences. And in that, surprisingly, perhaps, they're drawing on the work of Robert Boyle, who discusses that, like Bacon, the astrology, the baby shouldn't be thrown out with the bathwater, but he thinks it's very likely that you should pay attention in experiments to the placement of the moon in particular, and the folks in the Encyclopédie drew on that, and this is part of the separating out of the natural philosophical dimension of astrology from the more judicial, predictive parts of astrology.
So in a sense, there's a tendency for them to divide.
In a way to pull out the more scientific from the more practical parts, yes.
そのディドロとダランベルの百科全書の中においては、その占星術を2つに分ける考え方、自然的な自然アストロロジー、自然占星術って部分と、その占いに関わるジュディシャルアストロロジーって部分を分ける、なんていうんでしょうか、考え方があるんですけれども、そういったスタンスを採用して、自然界の中での天界と地界の関係における自然哲学としての部分っていうのは、例えばロバート・ボイルっていう英国人の著作なんかを使いつつも、その部分は議論していますけれども、そのジュディシャル、占いに関する部分の方の占星術っていうのは、扱いが、なんていうんでしょうか、隠されているとまでは言いませんけれども、非常に低い立場を取っているという感じですね。で、この話は、今日の話は短いショーターバージョンらしいんですけど、長いバージョンの方には、その百科全書、あるいは18世紀のフランスの啓蒙思想家たちの態度っていうのも扱われているそうです。Did you publish somewhere this longer version?
I may discuss it briefly in the Cambridge history piece.
なるほど。あそこに置いてある緑のこういう分厚い本の中にも、ケンブリッジから出ている科学史の教科書なんですけれども、その中に彼が書いた占星術についての一章の中でも少しそのことについて触れているそうです。 後でちょっと気になる人はチェックしてみてください。他に質問あります？その後ろの方からいきましょうか。ちょっと遠いんで、もうマイクは行きませんね。こちらに来てもらうのもちょっと難しいでしょうね。なんか少し大きな声で言ってください。
Thank you very much for your talk. It is interesting to know that Galileo practiced astrology. I want to know, did he reject astrology? That's the one question. And so, the second question is, in the middle of page 7, you wrote about Satan. But the operation of the heaven is not shown on all kinds of bodies, but only on final ones, such as humans or air and spirits. That's very interesting because other science, astrology, is not evaluated nowadays. But some people want to use astrology as kind of psychological So I want to know there are two parts of astrology that are kind of psychological question. And the other scientific question.
日本語でもちょっと簡単にかいつまんで質問してもらえます？皆さんに分かるよ。
最初の質問はガリレオが、要するに、先生術を結局、絶したのかどうかっていうことを。And there's a related question. What is the impact of Copernic revolution?
時間も限られてるんで、かいつまんで、なんか。
ガリレオと、だから、地動説っていうか、先生術の歴史にどういうインパクトを与えたかということで、関連したのか。
その質問でいいですか？他の人にも質問をしてほしいので。
心理的な不便という方向では強調するような関わっていったの。
Okay. With respect to your first question, I have found no evidence of Galileo rejecting astrology ever. But he doesn't discuss it very much. We have quite a lot of evidence for his practice. Certainly through 1610 or so, the horoscopes I showed up here, the work in the Sidereus Nuncius, we have a letter from 1618 from a cardinal called Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who wrote him asking him to make a horoscope for him and saying that he would do anything he could to help him out forever in any way, should he make the horoscope, but we have no evidence whether he actually made it for him. Then we have other evidence of him being associated with astrologers as late as 1629, 1630, so in the precise context in which the dialogue was published that seemed to have been part of the story of why he got into so much hot water with Pope Urban VIII, related to this guy Orazio Morandi, who you probably have never heard of, but who's very colorful and had this astrological political think tank in a church in Rome where he had all his monks making horoscopes about all the cardinals who were likely to become pope. And anyway, I won't go into great detail about that here, but Galileo and he were very close friends, and he was invited to have dinner with Morandi when he came to Rome to have the dialogue vetted by the Inquisition in order to be published. But then as soon as he went back to Florence, Morandi was thrown into jail for publishing these newsletters predicting the death of the Pope, which was one of the two ways that you would get into trouble with astrology. And even still, there's no evidence that he ever rejected astrology, at least that I know of. Do you want to?
そう、だからガリレオが占星術を拒絶したっていう結局証拠はなくて、例えば彼の友達には占星術に深く身を投じていたオラッチオ・モランディっていう人物が、オラッチオ、sorry、オラッチオ、
No, Orazio in Italian.
Orazio。で、彼はその人物と交流を持ったりするんですけども、オラッチオ・モランディは教皇の死を予言するノートを公にしちゃったんですね。そういうふうなことを社会的な行為にいる人の死を予言して、それを公にするっていうのは、教会にとっては非常に問題がある行為で、彼はオラッチオ・モランディはその後、牢獄に入れられてしまうんですけれども、そういう人物とも深い交流があった感じで。
The second question concerns celestial influences on the finer parts of the body, humors, air, and spiritus in Francis Bacon, which you keenly pointed out. So, in fact, there's an Aristotelian tradition in astrology and a less pronounced Platonic tradition in astrology. In the Aristotelian tradition, and Thomas Aquinas famously talked about this in his Summa Theologiae, the planets, because their bodies influence a person's body, and then directly, and then indirectly affect the mind of a person. Now, the mind is autonomous, and the mind rules the body, so a person, if they are a wise person, doesn't have to follow the precepts of the influences of the planets on the body. But in fact, most people follow the influences on the body. But this is one way that Aristotelians could maintain that humans have free will, even if they don't always use it. Then there's the Platonic tradition with Ficino, and I don't know if it happens before this, but for Ficino, and this is something I'm just now starting to understand, the planets for Ficino are in soul, and what that implies is that there are two registers between the planets and human beings. The bodily register, as in the Aristotelian tradition, but also the soul register. And for Ficino, the soul of the planet can act directly on the soul of a person by means of their spiritus. And that opens up an entirely new can of worms that are seemingly problematic for the maintenance of human free will. And this seems to be, at least in part, what Francis Bacon is drawing on. But also that's something I don't fully understand, whether Bacon has a fully developed soul register as Ficino does, or whether he's merely using spiritus, air, and humors as kind of a physical means. But I'm not sure I answered your question. It's very rich and interesting material that really hasn't been explored. Perhaps Hiro, from his researches, can illuminate aspects.
Just translate. Not all, but 要約すると、基本的なフレームワークはアリストテレスの考え方で、アリストテレスの場合は、ボディはボディに作用するんですね。で、ボディはマインドには作用しないんです。基本的には。だから、精神というのも天体、ボディなんですよね。ボディは基本的にはボディだけということなんですけれども、それがアリストテレスの、大学で普通に教えられていた。それに対して、ルネサンス期にはフィッチーノのプラトン主義 の説明が入ってくるんですけれども、そっちはボディの関係はそのままにあるんですけれども、宇宙自体に霊魂があるんですね。で、宇宙の霊魂っていうのは、生き物の霊魂に直接作用することができる。つまり、霊魂っていうのは、精神的なものとか、マインドの部分も関わっているわけで、その2つのチャンネルが、プラトン主義で、フィッチーノ以降のプラトン主義で、導入されるわけなんですけれども、ベーコンの場合は、じゃあ果たしてそのフィッチーノのように、その霊魂同士の天界の霊魂と、それから地上の我々のような生き物、人間の霊魂への影響っていう風なチャンネルを霊魂自体が作り上げていたかっていうのは彼は定かではないと。彼も前の方が質問があったような気がするんですけれども。ありました？
時間がないんだったらまた。
いや、いいですよ。どうぞどうぞ。
Thank you for speaking very much. 質問は日本語なんですけど、2つあって、1つは先ほど、ヨーロッパ大学や他の大学での推定がされている。ヨーロッパの主な大学では、同じような時期に同じようにリムーブ、切り離しを行っていたのかが1点と、最終的な切り離しが行われる1700年代の時に、合理主義や機械論が出てくる哲学的な、そういう科学的に大きいインパクトのあるものが、どう先生術、音楽にインパクトを与えて、どう影響しているかよく分かっているのかっていう、その2点についてお聞きしたいです。
1個目の質問は、
どこでも同じような時期に切り離しが行われていたのか。
The rejection of astrology, you took the example of Bologna, but her question is, in everywhere in Europe, it's some more or less different.
I think it is localized, and to fully understand it, we really need to see in the different places. And I think the framework of showing how it's removed from teaching in the different places is actually a framework that can answer the question. It's very easy to make all sorts of general claims, but I think this is perhaps the only, but to me, a very reasonable way of trying to understand the complex story of its removal in different places. And I've only, been able to explore some of them, and I have little bits of the story, but I think that they are suggestive, and of course it would be wonderful if there were other people doing research in this field and exploring different areas. I'm just one guy with limited capabilities.
そう、ボローニャのケースっていうのがヨーロッパ全体を象徴しているわけではなくて、そういうふうに単純化してしまうと話は危険で、それぞれの大学、それぞれの時期によって、その時期も違えば、なんて言うんでしょうか、リジェクションの行われ方っていうのも違う。Our second question is about the impact of mechanism from 17th century on astrology.
It's another complex story. Okay, first of all, I'm striving to complete my monograph, the big, reframing the scientific revolution, astrology, magic, and natural knowledge, circa 1250 to 1800. I'm almost done with volume 1, which is 1250 to 1500. And that's the period that I know more. What I know about the later period is more fragmentary, so just as background. What's interesting, the little bit that I know, and I certainly do not know very much about this, is that there is also a very complex story. And the one example that I can give you is Descartes seems to have rejected astrology. But one of his students, oh God, what's his name? Not Jacques Roux.
Regius? No.
Oh God, what's his name?
Frenchman?
Definitely French.
Oh.
Not Roux, because Roux basically rejects astrology too. I mean, he has some lunar stuff that there may be influences. But there's another one who actually proposes a reform of astrology based on Cartesian views in a way like what we saw in Ghisleri's introductory, that I didn't go into it, that I only know what I'm saying right now about, but that he's using both Descartes and Newton to propose a reform of astrology. I think this is a very rich and virtually completely unexplored area, and if you start looking into it, I look forward to learning from your researches, but I know very little, except that it's complex.
そう、彼は高官なね、3巻本の研究書を書いているうちの、1巻目がそろそろ終わる。First volume seems
1250 to 1500.
1500.
So, with Ficino and
1250年から500年ぐらいまで、ちょうどフィッチのあたりまでっていうのが第1巻に当たるんですけど、それはもうほぼできてる。で、その質問にあった部分っていうのは1600年代ですか、近代科学のサイエンティック科学革命と言われる時代については、まだまだ彼自身も研究が十分ではなくて、例えば、一つデカルトの例を挙げれば、デカルト自身は占星術を完全に、排除してますけれども、彼のフォロワーのうちの一人、それフランス人だってから言ってますけども、名前はちょっと忘れた。その人物はしっかりと占星術を取り込んだ形でのデカルト主義の著作っていうかな、ものを書いているという。だからまだまだその部分についてはわからないことも多いので、もし興味があれば、私のプロジェクトに参加して一緒にやりましょうと。他の質問あります？あと2つぐらいいきます。はい。
Thank you very much for your talk. I have one question. If you have any idea of the bands of astrology in the late antiquity, especially in second half of 4th century.
Do I know anything about astrology in the second half of the 4th century?
4世紀の後半ですね。古代ですね。
古代末期ですね。
ローマ帝国
とキリスト教化の段階で、占星術の性が結構50年間ぐらい、10年以上ですね、大体5世紀のぐらいまで行われてるんですけれども、それに関してもしご意見何かございましたら。
The simple answer is that I don't know very much about astrology in antiquity. I know, some basic outlines, and that astrology really became important politically around the time of Augustus. The work of Tamsin Barton, Power and whatever it's called, not Power and Prophecy, but the book where she kind of reconstructs how Augustus used astrology as a part of his political propaganda. And at that point, astrology starts to take off in a very serious way, and it seems to grow. And I know that other people draw on it, and I know that there's some evidence in there in Neugebauer and Van Hosen's book, some text, but I really don't have any solid knowledge about this. But once again, I think it's a very rich area for further investigation. Sorry, I didn't give you a better answer.
古代については、基礎知識は持っているけども、私は専門家でないので深いことは言えないんだけれども、アウグストゥスの皇帝のアウグストゥス帝の時に占星術っていうのが政治的にも政治的プロパガンダにおいてね、帝国内で皇帝権力のために使われるようになったと。だけれども、それがその4世紀以降の時期にどういうことが起きたかっていうのは残念ながら私には答えることができませんと。いう感じです。One more question. はい。
今日はどうもありがとうございます。17世紀以降に統計学っていうのが 計学的なところがあって、と相関性があって、この出来事ができるっていうようなことを、その詳細に調べるようになってきたっていうのが、今日のお話にあったと思うんですけども、それ以降に、誤差の論理とか、そういう近代数学的な統計学っていうのが、出てきて、それがこの生成術に影響を与えていると思います。
This question is that in your talk, it seems that there was about the rise of statistics, the science of statistics, 統計学なんて訳すの statistics, and so on in 17th century, right?
So I don't discuss that.
Oh yeah. That's why I was wondering. Anyway, he mentions that there is a rise of statistics in 17th century, and that science dealt with probability and so on. And this is what astrology was working on. And so his question is that the rise of modern mathematics, like statistics and so on, had any impact on the life of astrology?
Once again, that is a very interesting question that is calling out for further research by people who know a lot more about these things than I do. Alas. Believe me, I wish I knew everything. It would make my life a lot easier. But if you do explore it, please let me know. I'd love to learn more about it myself. I want to say that Giuseppe Toaldo in this reform at the end of the 18th century brought these aspects into account, but I only have a superficial knowledge of his work. But there was a 1,000-page volume of collected essays that came out 8 or so years ago by many competent Italian astrologers, not astrologers, scholars, and there may be something along these lines in there, but I have no idea, quite frankly. But thank you for the question.
とても重要な質問だと思うんですけれども、私の彼のね、限られたキャパシティでは、すべてのことはカバーすることは不可能で、その点についても明確な答えをすることはできません。その近年にイタリアンスカラーですね。イタリアの学者たちが高官な論集を出したりしてるんですけれども、私自身はなんていうかな、その明確な答えはMaybe last question? 最後の質問いきます。まだ時間的には大丈夫ですか？1個ぐらいですか？1個。よし君。
Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. I have a question about the relationship between astrology and apocalypticism. So you could talk about Middle Ages as well too, because that was big as well. But interesting relationship between the introduction of astrology in Protestant countries like we said, Milan and 1530s, and also in 1640s. Both times are very apocalyptic, politically very uprising. There are many uprisings. There are many prophecies, so-called prophecies of end times. So astrology is basically talking about what the regularity of stars tell you, right? Apocalypticism is some sort of breaking in of divine activity, right? Stopping of this regularity. So there are people who are talking about in astrological field end times. How did those things work together, or didn't work together, or did they have conversations or arguments?
Exactly.
Translation.
Oh, yes.
目視思想っていうのが、アポカリプティック。
黙示録の黙示って意味。
そうですね。終末論っていうのが1930年代とか1940年代のイギ
いいですけど、1930年代のドイツでは結構疑われてたんですけども、その両方ともプロテスタントの国々に先生術が入ってきたときに、それがどういう、先生術もその終末論的な、最後的なことを言ったりするので、もしそこでの噛み合いというか、2つの思想が全く別個のものなのか、関係があったのかという。
終末論というのは、世界の最後が近づいていて、最後の審判の日が近いんだっていうやつですよね。
それが政治的な関係があって。
That's a great question, and mercifully, I do know something about this, at least a little bit. There are kind of 2 points I want to make about this. First of all, as you're saying, astrology is about the regular motion of the planets, and we understand, they understood from the 13th century on at least, and from Ptolemy on even more so, how the planets move and that eclipses are regular parts of celestial activity, and we can predict these things. Comets, on the other hand, were irregular celestial features that burst into the world, and it was precisely the comet of 1531 that, blew Melanchthon's mind and got him very excited about learning about astrology. So you have these 2 kind of poles in the celestial domain that go on until Newton, of course, resolves the problem and explains that comets themselves are regular phenomena, and now we had enough evidence about them and a proper mathematical and cosmological framework for explaining them. Okay, so at that point, comets ceased to be this irregular kind of act of, it's related to the distinction between God's ordained and God's absolute power. So the planetary structures were his ordained power, but comets bursting through were part of his absolute power. Okay, so kind of that's one piece of the story. The other piece of the story is that there was, and I don't know if you know about this, but you may well, there was an astrological framework for understanding history that was based on the great conjunctions of the 2 outer planets known then, i.e. Jupiter and Saturn, which conjoin every 20 years in this strikingly triangular pattern where, okay, there are 3 levels of great conjunctions. Every 20 years they conjoin. And then in the same elemental triplicity. So the first sign is Aries, right? So let's say hypothetically the first conjunction is in Aries, second conjunction will be in Sagittarius, third conjunction will be in Leo, then back to Aries and back to Sagittarius and Leo, and each time they move forward 2.5 degrees, I believe. So after 12 conjunctions, it moves into the next elemental triplicity from fire to earth. So every 20 years is a significant conjunction. Then when it shifts triplicity, it marks a major change in the nature of politics, religion, etc. on Earth. And this was taken to have kind of rich meaning, but within the ordained structure. So that's every 240 years it shifts triplicity. And then after 960 years, as in 800 when Charlemagne became king, and then again in 1600, anyway, there's some wiggle room with whether it's 960 or 800 because it goes into the new triplicity, and then it comes back in retrograde motion, and then it goes again. But when that happens, as it did in 1600, 1601, and then with the comet of 1603, there was all this apocalyptic fervor at that time as well, and Kepler wrote a treatise about this. So that, in fact, Pierre Dailly, do you know this story? There was a lot of, well, he thought the end of the world was nigh, right, around 1400 or so, and then he started to learn more about astrology, and then he found out, based on this pattern of great conjunctions from Roger Bacon, that from the 13th century, that in fact, the end of the world based on his calculations could be pushed back to 1789 of all years. So he actually resolved the great schism of the church based on his understanding of astrology, which is really mainly to say that this is once again a rich nexus of very interesting ideas in which apocalypticism in the medieval period, as well as, well into the 17th century, is, very active. It's not some sort of simple, dialogue between ideas, but it's this really rich nexus which is expressed very differently at different times. Anyway, that's pointing towards a proper, coherent answer to you.
今の答えは非常に長くて私の力で訳せるかどうかわからないんですけど、かいつまんで言わさせてもらうと、終末論のセッティングにおいてもね、それ非常に良い質問で、例えば彼が挙げていたのは、彗星の問題ですね。彗星が現れるっていうのは、神様が作った普通の宇宙の中に、彗星が出現するっていうのは、普段の神の通常の力とは別のもっとすごい神様の力、アブソリュートな力で投入するっていうことっていうのは、政治的にいくらでも読み込める現象であったし、もう一つはこれは非常に先生術の中で難しい、いつも頭を悩まされる議論なんですけども、コンジョンクションっていうのはね、ゴーっていう、合うってことですか。それで、which planets?
Jupiter and Saturn.
木星と土星のゴーが20年に1回、once 20 years、right? 20年に1回起こるんですけども、毎回ズレが生じて、それでそれが起こる星座っていうのがある一定の時期を超えると次の星座で起こるようになるんですね、その12級の中で。で、それっていうのも非常に大きな政治的な意味を読み込めたりね、それを使って政治的な利用をすることが可能であったもので、宗教回復の時期っていうのは、そういったパンフレットなんかでの、やり取りとかで、プロパガンダとしてね、非常に、利用されるものがあったんですけども、16世紀の後半末になって、その終末が近いと言われた時期に、特に例えば1605年でしたが、05、1605、03? Oh, sorry.
1600 was a great conjunction. The comet came in 1603.
3年にグレートコンジャンクションがあって、彗星が1605年に現れるんですね。その2つのものが、すごい短い、天文学的には2年という短い期間なんですけど、その2年の間に起きたっていうのは、非常に大きな、なんていうかな、その星を見る人たちにとってはね、意味深いものが近づいてるっていう、第二の、彼が第二のキリストの現れを示してるんじゃないかっていうようなね、そういう解釈をする人たちも出てくるぐらいのものを生んだんですね。17世紀の初めの10年に起きたわけ。それくらいに終末論っていうのは非常にリッチななんていうかな、先生術と政治とか社会との関係を象徴しているエレメントの一つであるというふうに。それではね、皆さん8時になって時間も押してきましたんで、大きな拍手で、ちょっと、このポスターを作ってくれたのは、そこに座ってる、私の嫁のクレアで、このパワーポイント2、yeah? So, 一つ 宣伝させてください。先ほど紹介しましたエミさんと出した本、これカルダーノの天才カルダーノの肖像で、ルネサンスの自叙伝占星術夢解釈というもので、占星術についての章もしっかりあって、そのカルダーノの占星術師としての自然観、世界観を知るためで非常に大事な本なんですけれども、この出版を記念して、そこに座っている久美君と、それからエイミーさんと3人で8月3日に、池袋のリブロってところでトークショーをやりますので、ウェブで見ますとね、どういうふうに予約すればいいかっていうのは分かりますので、ぜひとも皆さんお越しください。そこでもさらに占星術についての話で盛り上がると思います。今日はどうも皆さんありがとうございました。